Jack Henneman, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Delighted to be here as a dad and somebody who would love to save America.
Good. Well, those are the prerequisites.
Understood.
So you've got a background in politics, in law, also in entrepreneurship. But you are here today because you have a podcast that is really interesting and very unique and very, very of the moment that we are in, which is the 250th birthday of this country. And that is the History of the Americans podcast. Why did you start this thing? Let's just start there, because you are going chronologically, basically from Columbus to the present eventually. Like what started this project? And
Depends
then
how long I live. Yeah. So the origin of it is, I talk about it in the introductory episode of the podcast. I retired from, I say job in November of 2018, and I work about a quarter time even now in my old industry, medical devices. But during the pandemic in September of 2020, when I felt I should go visit my old mom in Charlottesville, Virginia, I swabbed up and went on a road trip to Charlottesville. And then after I avoided making my mom sick, I hit the road and did a sort of 4,500 mile pandemic drive about, see America during that time. And I'd text friends and anyone who wanted to have a beer on their front yard or whatever. I went hiking in the Adirondacks, did all sorts of stuff. Anyway, along the way, I was listening to podcasts and notifying people on Facebook, and a law school roommate of mine texted me and said, "You really have to listen to David Crowther's History of England podcast," which is this super granular telling of English history from ancient times. And he's been going on 13, 14 years now.
They've got a longer history.
They got a longer history. And I probably listened to 30 or 40 episodes, and somewhere along the way, I'm like, I wonder if anyone has done a similar thing for us. And I sort of started digging around, and no one really had. All the history podcasts are either, they sort of bounce around, they'll talk about Prohibition this week and the, Battle of Antietam next week, or they're hyper-focused. Like there's an American Revolution podcast that's over 400 episodes long. So that's really, people think I'm detailed, right? And so I thought, I'd always wanted to read American history in some structured way. So I really had it thematically in my head. And I sort of came back and thought the podcast might be a forcing function, and I'd either like it and it would work, or I wouldn't like it and I'd stop doing it. So I launched it at the beginning of 2021. New Year's Day was the first episode. And I didn't tell anyone for a couple months, but then I figured out I'm going to keep doing this. And I have a sort of several friends out there with big Twitter followings and the like, from old days writing a blog under a pen name. And they spread the word, and I've got a following, so it's fun.
Okay, I'll keep this quick. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so that you won't miss more Dad Saves America as our videos come out each week. And it also really helps us, because when we reach out to guests, they look at how many subscribers there are to decide if they want to come on and share their ideas. So please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out, and thanks for watching. Now, back to the show.
The first time as an adult that my attention was drawn to the sort of pre-revolution, post-Columbus, and perhaps post-Pilgrims, right? Because it's like the two sort of pre-revolution moments that I feel like we all get stamped into our minds is Columbus and then the Pilgrims, like Thanksgiving. But also became popular in that 2020 period, and that's the 1619 Project. So the 1619 Project launches I think it was the aftermath of George Floyd now. That whole period is a jumble. but basically putting forth a thesis that to understand the United States, you really need to look at our founding as being 1619, not 1776, when the first slaves arrive, I think, in Virginia. Before we rewind even further back in 1619, how has your reading of America's history, how does it intersect with that project? It's an ideological project. It's a project of the left, but to just be fair to its attempts to rewrite history or flesh out history, perhaps. It all depends on your perspective. What's your perspective on it?
Well, Phil Magnus wrote a whole book a year or so ago that sort of takes apart key elements of it, and I had him on for a conversation. I read his book and had him on for a conversation about that. So anyone who really wants to hear in depth to go hunt it down on my podcast. That said, look, the 1619 project, it was actually kicked off in the summer of 2019 because it was pre-Floyd.
Oh, that's right.
Because it was essentially the anniversary of the 400th anniversary of the so-called 20 and odd Negroes who came to Jamestown that summer, having been captured by Dutch privateers off, I think, a Portuguese ship that was selling slaves. And they came to Virginia, and their ultimate destiny is fairly controversial, and I'd be happy to talk about that if interesting. But this was clearly used by the New York Times in a way that was designed to reshape education. So it was essentially weaponized to reshape the national education system around it. And I think the evidence for that is not just simply the materials they produced for the newspaper and the book they did, but the fact that the New York Times actually developed a whole public school curriculum built around this. So it was a conscious attempt to weaponize history. And that broad topic, really no matter who does it, is one that offends me greatly for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think it does a huge disservice to the study of history. Whether you are on the left or on the right, and there have been plenty of examples of weaponizing history on the right as well.
I had Gordon Wood on this show a couple of years ago, and we had talked at some length about the project. And he had he was among the sort of celebrated historians who sort of came out with a critique of things that just got wrong.
Yeah.
But what is the deeper? You're pointing towards a deeper thing, almost a methodological component to it. And one of the things you talk about at the starts of your podcast is avoiding what you call presentism.
Yeah.
Is that part of your problem with the project?
Yeah. So there's sort of two things, broadly speaking, I don't like. So presentism is applying today's morality and beliefs to the study of history. And so, it amounts to prejudice in the past. And you might say, well, how is that wrong? Or what's the problem with it? And I would suggest the following. If you were to travel to some foreign culture, a tribe in the Amazon, a Muslim city in Central Asia, and your assessment of that culture was shaped entirely by your norms having grown up affluent in the United States in Austin, Texas, you would be blinded to why people did the way things did. That application of your preconceived notions would frankly get in the way of your ability to understand what was really going on in that tribe in the Amazon or city in Central Asia or wherever else. Well, this is reflected in an old expression about history, that the past is a foreign country. And they do things differently there. It under that reasoning, it makes no more sense to apply your norms to, let's forget Jamestown in 1619. Let's say the General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635 when they booted out Roger Williams. Why did they do that? A topic I talk about in the podcast. It makes no sense to stare at that as a 21st century American and say, well, they were jerks, That doesn't illuminate a thing. So presentism is prejudice in examining the past in a way that interferes with your ability to understand it. And I think that people who do it are obscuring rather than illuminating, and they're betraying their profession. And there are plenty of historians that do it. Of course, the people who did the 1619 project are quick to say they're not historians. Some of them were actually, but they were doing journalism when called on this, which is a point Philip Magnus makes and Gordon Wood has certainly made. But rather than centering on them, I just say, if you're applying your values of today to then, you're going to obscure the understanding of it. Now,
well, and just to linger on that claim for a second, to help me understand even the way you're framing this idea, to say, well, we're not historians, we're journalists. Well, then I'm not even trying to understand what that means as an argument. Like, well, you're looking to the past, so you're looking to the deep past. What is the different standard here by saying you're a journalist? Aren't you trying to get the truth? And isn't it a question of understanding what the truth is?
Well, I am neither a historian or a journalist. I would have thought that the main goal of a journalist is to sell papers or whatever other media are in question. So I think, they legitimately have different motives. I would say, looking at efforts like the 1619 project, to me, the problem in that case was related to presentism and included the application of it. But it was really the overt effort to use history to make a contemporaneous political point. And the reason weaponizing history, and this happens on the right. I mean, the history of the Civil War was largely rewritten by a group of mostly Southern, but not entirely Southern scholars about 100 years ago to sort of make the Confederacy more noble than it was during the Gone with the Wind era, right? So this is something that has happened before. But the problem with weaponizing history for this goes to what I think is the main purpose of studying history, which is to teach wisdom, what my friend Greg Lukianoff says, epistemic humility, knowing what you don't know. So the history teaches that there's an enormous amount we don't know, and that people acting in good faith, even great people, can make colossal errors of judgment along the way when viewed in retrospect. History teaches that. It teaches epistemic humility. I think that anyone who, just to suggest a sidebar thought, anyone who believes they know how this war in Iran is going to turn out right now is guessing, on frankly both sides, in my opinion. So I think that epistemic humility being the objective of teaching history, well, what's the posture of political partisans? It's epistemic arrogance. There's no concession from anyone in politics that they don't know exactly their point and exactly what will happen if they do X, Y, or Z. So if you use history, which is meant to teach humility and wisdom, in the service of partisan politics, which teaches precisely the opposite, you're really corrupting history absolutely. And it's cheap. It's like sometimes you'll encounter politically engaged, very religious people who will quote a line of scripture cherry-picked to support their policy prescription, ignoring other lines of scripture that might go the other way.
Like render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, for example.
A million such examples better scholars than I would be able to identify.
Yeah.
Well, you can do that with history too. It's very easy to pick a fact or a moment or a line of argument or something somebody said in a diary and say, see, this is what they were trying to do. But history is not done that way. History is taken in the broad context of the moment, studied in the broad context of the moment. And you can't do that. And anyone who tries is, in my opinion, being intellectually dishonest.
So let's get into our time machine and see how much of this span we can interrogate together. Because your podcast, you're over 200 episodes now, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I encourage everybody to subscribe to it, to go even deeper. We can only sort of skim across the surface. But for so many of us and for our kids, even skimming over the surface will be better than a lot of what we will all have retained, or even what our kids will sometimes be taught in school. Is the right place to start Columbus?
Well, that's an excellent question. So there's another famous expression, which is history always begins in the middle of something. And picking when your history or your conception of it starts is a sort of inherently arbitrary. And when I started on this, when I first thought about it, driving my car around, and then I got back to Austin in mid-October of 2020, I immediately bought books on Jamestown and Plymouth and read them. And I started digging through notes and everything. And suddenly I realized I was missing, 110 years of Spanish incursions in the lands of today's United States, which is how I define the podcast. So, you start with Ponce de Leon in Florida, and you have a whole series of Spanish explorations, some of which are astonishing and people know very little about today. Some of which people have a vague sense, like people have heard of Hernando de Soto because, the Chrysler Corporation had a sedan named after him and stuff. But they used to loom very large in how we taught history. FDR set up an entire commission of academics during the New Deal to study the route of Hernando de Soto's 3.5-year romp through the SEC conference, in 1539 to 1542. So I figured out, okay, you got to do these. Well, none of it makes sense unless you talk about Columbus first.
Okay.
So you have to talk about Columbus. Now, of course, you can go earlier than that because there's all sorts of roots in Columbus. Columbus was himself the product of geopolitical competition. The Iberians were desperately trying to find a way to bypass the Arab Muslim monopoly on trade with Asia.
Right. I was just reminded, and to say reminded suggests I really heard this and retained it at any point in my life, that Ferdinand, is it king, the Ferdinands, right?
Ferdinand and Isabella were dual monarchs.
So they were dual monarchs.
They formed essentially Spain. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and they married and essentially unified Spain. Not entirely.
So that is like the tail end. 1492 is the tail end of the sort of reconquista of the Spanish peninsula, of the Iberian Peninsula, from essentially Islamic takeover. So, Islam sweeps Christendom along the south of the Mediterranean, makes that incursion across that, what is it? Is it the Bering Strait? Am I remembering that right?
No.
No, what is that strait right there? That short jump. from Africa to Spain.
I forget the name of this,
But yeah.
but it's where Trafalgar was fought.
Yeah. So
Gibraltar.
I didn't realize how like that history connects straight to it's these two people who send Columbus on his way.
Yeah, and in fact, they had deferred his various
The Strait of
requests.
Gibraltar. That's what it is. The Strait of Gibraltar.
They had deferred his various attempts to get funded for this until after they had dealt with the Moors. And he, in fact, was with them when they marched in on January 1st, 1492, and just sort of, it came to an end. And so, yes, that you could start earlier for sure than Columbus himself. But Columbus, becomes relevant. So why does Ponce de Leon start exploring to the north in the expedition that identifies Florida, and during which he names Florida? Well, he does because he's been made governor of Puerto Rico, but Diego Columbus, the admiral's son, sues and says, no, I'm entitled to that under my father's deal with the dual monarchs. And he actually wins and in the Spanish courts. And Charles V gives Ponce de Leon essentially a license, they called them patents, to explore north of Puerto Rico, and he'd be entitled to lands he uncovered and that kind of stuff, as sort of a consolation prize for having been stripped of the governorship of Puerto Rico. So you don't get Ponce de Leon without litigation around Columbus's deal with Ferdinand and Isabella.
When at that time, when the Spanish first begin to explore the New World, there's obviously native populations. Who was here? Like who? Like really, what did it look like?
Well, there's a lot of controversy over the population of the Western Hemisphere during that period, but the sort of center, I think, of the population guesses are the whole Western Hemisphere had maybe 75 million people, and there might have been 10 million north of the Rio Grande. So North America was thinly populated. I think the highest estimates for North America are like 18 million pre-contact, but they range from like 2 to 18 million. There's a big argument over this for all kinds of reasons. The rest were in the big civilizations in Mexico and in South America.
The sort of heirs to the Aztecs.
Well, they were the Aztecs. So you had the Aztecs, and then in South America you had the Incas, and they were both these big civilizations with big cities and a lot of precious metal, and very much worth conquering. And the Spanish famously did. And I don't much cover that because it's outside of the boundaries of today's United States, but you have to mention
Cortez and the search for...
Yeah, I mean, Cortez in New Spain, Mexico, and then Pizarro and his sidekick, Hernando de Soto, in Peru. And then Soto, after a stint as a governor in Central America, takes his fortune back to Spain and cooks up a big expedition in North America, because the Spanish are completely convinced, wrongly, that there was a third big civilization kind of worth conquering in North America. They thought there was a third. There has to be one. There was one here and there was one here, so there must be one up there that's also got a lot of gold and silver. So we're going to hunt for it.
I mean, one of the ironic things when you look back at Spanish conquest and this, you should try to look at that through the lens of today's like anti-colonial talk, is that Spain is like a middling, kind of poor European country today, kind of a basket case, like Italy.
Yeah, but it went through its period of being a powerful country west of China.
But yeah, I think the thing that the notion that the wealth of the U.S., for example, can best be understood as imperial in nature at least has an alternative in like what current Spain looks like. Because if anybody was going to be kicking butt, it should have been the Spanish. They had this massive empire. I mean,
Well, they did. And they frittered it away, as empires often do.
so you've got the Spanish that are the Spanish the biggest first colonizers in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, the Portuguese get a chunk of it by edict of the Pope, but the Portuguese are primarily focused on Asia. And so, in fact, the reasons why the Portuguese did not buy Columbus's deal, he shopped his proposal. It was really a venture deal. he shopped it in not just Spain, but also Portugal, France, and England. Henry VII of England almost bit. So one of the things that's interesting to think about is how would the world have been different if Columbus had sailed with an English crew under Henry VII? Might have been quite a bit different.
Yeah.
But not for long, but it would have unfolded in a different direction, for sure.
Did Columbus really think he was going to hit the Far East in his travels? Is that apocryphal? We're all taught like he's heading. That's why we call them Indians.
He the whole goal everyone had in mind, it was a shortcut to Asia, and the reason why the Portuguese didn't fund him was that they were interested, and they'd been funding exploration since the 1540s. You may remember, or the 1440s, excuse me. You may remember Prince Henry the Navigator, who set up essentially an incubator for exploration. He hired all the mathematicians and astronomers and sailors he could find to fund exploration south. And in 1488, so 4 years before Columbus's first voyage, Bartholomew Diaz rounds the Cape, and they figure out they can get to Asia. His crew mutinies by the time he gets on sort of the east coast of South Africa, off Durban somewhere. So he has to turn back. But they've rounded it.
I mean, all the way down to the southern.
It's a really long trip. It's a really long trip. And he gets back.
1400s boats.
So the Portuguese, all right, we got it. And Vasco da Gama, I think, this is not my field because I didn't cover it, but they get there a few years later. They get to India. So they're not so interested in whatever it was to the west Columbus found.
But was there any knowledge of these giant continents in the Western Hemisphere?
Essentially, no. They all thought it was eastern outposts of Asia, like maybe islands to the east of Asia.
Gotcha.
Which they knew about. Marco Polo. There'd been long distance trade with the Chinese, but all sorts of weird stuff had been happening that were pointing to something that you would only spot in retrospect. So, like, for example, there were cases of bodies with Asiatic features washing up on the Azores. They were almost certainly North American Indians, because if you're like a European of the 15th century, you have this very vague sense of what an Asian person looks like, but it's not like you've seen a photograph,
Right. You've maybe seen some drawings.
You've read a description and seen some drawings. So who are these people? Well, they probably were Indians blown out and drowned in some storm,
Wow. So, we're here in Texas, and one of the things that, as a Northeasterner myself, I'm born in Philadelphia, American history is so focused, in the Revolutionary period and the English colonial period in the Northeast, in the 13 colonies, that the identity of America feels like it is primarily English, like English descent. But you've got these giant swaths that are Spanish, that are Spanish oriented long before that.
Yeah.
How has looking back at that period shaped the way you think about like American identity?
It's heavily reshaped it. my last name's German, but I'm mostly English in my own ancestry, and I definitely sort of labored under the same framework, I'll say, until I started doing this. But then you realize that the Spanish influence was massive, just in a part of the country that was not foundational to the civil society that became the United States. But, the Pueblos in New Mexico, which still have a robust society, living in the same towns they've lived in for centuries, definitely remember the Spanish. And they're Americans, So I think remembering how big the country is, and all the various influences upon it is a gift.
What is after Columbus, what's the next most important milestone, let's say, as you've traversed the time? Is it Jamestown? Is it what is the next thing that the ignorant like me should know about the early formation of the North America, the United States?
So I would say the roots of the United States as it has come to be are downstream of the massive geopolitical and confessional war between Catholic Spain and the Dutch and the English. So, a lot of things in this world happen because of geopolitical rivalry. You can see a hint of this now in the development of AI. Everyone is, I'd say close to everyone, is kind of anxious about this proceeding in a pell-mell way, but no one can figure out whether there's any way to regulate it because of geopolitical considerations.
Right.
We don't want to slow down ours because if our geopolitical adversaries gain an edge, it could be a catastrophe. Well, almost exactly the same thinking applied to the colonization of North America. The Spanish had this sort of century-long jump, and they were using the vast precious metals and other resources of Central and South America to fund basically the Counter-Reformation. They were trying to squash Protestantism, and they fought endless wars to do this, which is part of the reason they dissipated their empire. But this was their moving consideration, so they had to do it. Well, the English, being scrappy and innovative, fought Elizabeth I in principle, and her advisors were brilliant, and they fought a long, delaying war. They tried to contain the Spanish, much as we did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, with a much smaller ground force. So what did they do? They had privateers who sailed out of the West Country in England and would raid Spanish shipping. Well, that worked. It really annoyed Spain. But the privateers could only be so effective because they had to sail all the way back to England to, kind of reload whatever it was. And so the English had the idea, if we could set up settlements on the east coast of North America, we could have a base for our privateers much closer to the Spanish shipping lines.
Interesting. I didn't know this.
So the famous lost colony of Roanoke, which was Sir Walter Raleigh's project in 1585 to 1587 on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, was, among other things, meant to be a forward operating base for English privateers. It had other objectives as well. You always needed many reasons to do a thing. So geopolitical competition played a very big part in this.
Who are the early English Americans? Because one of the things that I've been thinking about in like thinking about the history of the country this year in particular, is that when you think about the people standing there in 1776 declaring independence, again, like we grow up thinking they're like English subjects and they have like some sense of affinity to England. But in many cases, maybe most, the people there go back generations on this continent, right?
Yes.
So it's like it's like a horrible, scary, long, treacherous trip to go back to England. Most of them would have never done it.
George Washington was maybe the wealthiest American at the beginning of the war, and he never went back to England. He never went back at any point.
Yes, so you have a people who are a distinct people by the time it's 1776. So who are they in the 1500s and early 1600s? Who are these people?
I think, I think that's an excellent point, and it also points to reasons for the several huge conflicts that erupted almost exactly 100 years before the American Revolution. King Philip's War in New England, Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. They were, I think the first thing that is really underemphasized is the sort of wild differences between the tobacco colonies on the Chesapeake, Virginia, and to a lesser example, Maryland, on the one hand, and the Puritan settlements of New England on the other. I mean, these two societies were about as different as any two subcultures in the entire English world at that time. I mean, so the Puritans in New England, highly literate because you had to read the Bible, essentially urbanized. They lived in villages and farmed outside the villages.
Yeah.
Because you had to go to church. They had very long lifespans, the longest lifespans in the English world, longer than in England.
Why? Do we have any sense of why that was?
It was really healthy. It turns out winters that cold, and then they were really cold. Okay.
Yeah.
Winters that cold, just kill off a lot of the things that might kill you.
So if you survive the winter, you're really literally the only one standing by the spring.
Right. And
you and the polar bears are together.
The ground wasn't great for big farming. The soil wasn't great. So they didn't ever build a plantation economy that required lots of labor. Instead, they had small farms that people worked themselves, and they had livestock, and they had lots and lots of fish and game. So,
Yeah.
they essentially could
lobster bisque.
pull protein out of the water at any time. And so they were very well fed, and they were extremely fertile. New England women would have, making it up, 15 pregnancies, and 10 of them or more would survive. And they would go on and have another 6, 8, 10 kids in the next generation. So they lived a long time. They were startlingly egalitarian, not by our standards today, but by the standards of the English world.
Yeah.
Your influence within the community was as much a function of how pious you were and how successful you were at whatever it was you were doing, farming, trade, or whatever else, as it had to do with your birth. There was very little of that.
Is this, we have this idea of the Protestant work ethic. Maybe this is broader than New England in its sort of roots, but is that a part of that? That it's sort of survive the winter, have a sense of delayed gratification, these things are very essential to the flourishing of the commercial society in the U.S., aren't they?
Yeah, and it goes beyond a sort of, happenstance. It was deeply theological in its roots. So the Puritans believed that they believed two things which would be very strange for us today. So the first thing is they believed that because of God's omniscience and omnipotence, okay, there was nothing you could do to change the odds of making it into heaven or not.
Is this Calvinism? Is this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Puritanism was the English version of Calvinism.
Gotcha. So this is sort of your grace is predetermined, and that's it.
And that's it. The sort of seemingly controversial, or countervailing notion or inconsistent notion is that your success in life would be evidence of sainthood. It wouldn't prove sainthood, but it would be evidence of sainthood. And since in order to be a saint, you had to be a saint to be a member of the church, you had to be a member of the church to vote, okay, there were these tremendous structural incentives around material success, because material success was evidence of God's favor, and you needed evidence of God's favor to have any influence in the community. And this was profoundly believed. This wasn't cynical.
Yeah.
Certainly not in the early days of the Winthrop fleet and everything else. So people worked super hard to become prosperous, and they did so under pretty arduous conditions.
So you have these northern pilgrims. They're highly literate. That has these echoes much later in Massachusetts being the most literate state, being sort of the birthplace of public education in the United States and stuff like that.
Yeah. And they start universities. And again, you had to read. There was a law requiring parents to make sure their kids learn to read. I think it's the first such law in the West, maybe anywhere in the world.
Harvard University is in the Boston area, as was MIT, and so you've got this hub, and that goes back to the 1600s.
Well, Harvard's the first, and the first school in America, in the Latin school in Boston, was founded right in that period. It's still going. You can still send your kid to it if kid's smart enough, and I think you have the money. I don't know. So New England just had this base, and it was weird for another reason, which is that its main period of inbound migration was only from, began a little bit with the Pilgrims in 1620, but it really ran from 1628 to 1640. And this had to do with the oppression of the Puritans in England under Elizabeth's successors, and essentially the Stuarts, James I and Charles I, especially Charles I, who was a big Anglican, and they persecuted the Puritans. So they left. A bunch went to Ireland, a bunch went to the Caribbean, and a bunch went to New England. That persecution ended when the English Civil War broke out in the early 1640s. The Puritans won that and executed Charles, and Oliver Cromwell sort of you may vaguely remember these names.
Yeah.
And so the Puritans were now in charge in England, so there was no new stream of refugees, and indeed a bunch of New Englanders went back because they were religious refugees. None of that was going on in Virginia. The Virginians were the Virginians consisted of a thin band of gentlemen, confirmed Anglicans and Royalists overwhelmingly. And then underneath the Virginians, you had this just constant flow of indentured servants who would come over and they would work making principally tobacco in these plantations, and 3/4 of them would die before their indentures ran out.
One of the things that you see even in the movies about the South, but you kind of feel it even in, let's say, the Southern hospitality, is almost an Old English royal thing.
UVA calls their sports team the Cavaliers. I mean, I mean, it runs. It was wildly different, and they had so Virginia just had this massive death rate for all kinds of reasons, including much worse problems with disease and all the rest of this. So, I mean, just people would go over and they just died for decades. And what did that mean? Well, it meant a bunch of things. Turned out men died a lot more than women for reasons that are not totally understood. So you ended up with these serial rich widows who would remarry in the upper classes. And then you just had this population of people who had been just treated miserably badly. I'm talking about English people who'd come over as indentured servants. Why were they treated badly? Well, their pay for their 5 or 6 years of their contract consisted of the voyage over. So they had been paid everything up front. And after that...
Wait, so I just want to put myself in this, and we'll obviously talk about slavery, but in this indentured servants. So who are you in England that you are this indentured servant? What did you do? Are you a debt? Are you like the debtor's prison? What's happening?
Yeah, probably in some cases, but you're deeply impoverished. England had gone through a huge disruption in its economy in the 1500s. So you may vaguely remember the common pasture lands were enclosed by the landlords. And this essentially dispossessed all of these peasants. And the main English export in Elizabethan times was woolen cloth. And for a variety of reasons, the market for that weakened tremendously. So England was in a very tough economic position under Elizabeth. And it was especially bad if you were, a working man in a village somewhere in rural England. And these people were just in terrible shape. And so the prospect of, the prospect of moving, going to the New World, you've been fed a pack of lies. No one said there was an 80% death rate or anything.
You're going to go to the New World, but you're going to get the pre-American dream.
But even so, the idea is you go over there, and at the end of it, you get a bunch of land. Okay. So you go over there, and your goal as an indentured servant is to survive. The master's goal is to get as much work out of you as possible. So while there was indentured servitude in England, okay, it was highly regulated. There was a competitive market for servants, so no master wanted to be known as a terrible... None of that existed in Virginia. In Virginia, the laws slowly evolved to allow ever more brutal treatment of the indentured servants, because that was the only way to get them to work. They were just trying to survive to the end of 5 years. And the main penalty that could be imposed on them for breaking the law or doing whatever, running away, was a lengthening of their term of servitude. So you could add a year or two to that. So that was the main means of social control. And some of them did survive, and they got farms, which they would carve out, but there were no towns. They were struggling to compete with large planters. They were masterless men, as some historians call them, in Virginia and to some degree in Maryland. And they were illiterate by and large. They didn't go to church because there were no towns, no churches. It was really rough for them. And on top was this thin layer of immensely wealthy planters.
It's really, I never really thought, I've thought about, because especially when you go to small towns, you see the central fixture of the church in the downtown, especially like these small Texas towns where it'll be right there.
Yeah.
But throughout the country. I never really thought about the fact that actually the entire premise of why you would build a town would be to be able to be within walking distance of church services. But of course, it makes sense.
Certainly true in New England, yes.
So you've got this southern brutal bifurcated society of aristocrats and rich widows with indentured servants and slaves.
So the slaves are slow to arrive.
Okay, so let's talk about how long is there English settlement and culture in the South of the United States, of the East Coast, before slavery starts to become a thing, African slaves, chattel slavery?
Well, that's an important qualification because the English in the South especially were enslaving Indians very early on.
Okay.
And that's actually one of the really unemphasized things. They were being enslaved both for local use and for sale to the plantation colonies in the Caribbean, which had a chronic need for slaves to grow sugar, which was even rougher than tobacco, much rougher than tobacco. If somebody said you've got to spend a year in the tobacco fields or a year in the cane fields, take the tobacco field for sure.
Why? Why was the cane sugar so much harder? Harder to harvest.
I'm not an expert. Everything about it. It cut you. The climate was brutal. You had these furnaces and huge fires that you'd have to tend to refine it. It was just unbelievable how
it was
rough
the coal mines of its time.
It was the coal mines of its time, or worse. So anyway, Jamestown gets settled in 1607. It takes years before it's definitely going to make it. In fact, they throw in the towel and abandon it for 2 days in 1610. And as the last survivors, who are cadaverous from starvation, are sailing out the James, a big resupply shows up, with Lord Delaware leading it and 400 new settlers, and he orders these poor people to turn around and go back. So there was a 2-day abandonment of Jamestown. But it takes a while. So in 1619, they come in, and there's a lot of argument, almost all weaponized in one direction or another, about the status of the blacks who came in 1619, because there were no laws addressing slavery. There was no system in place. Several of them become free. At least one becomes wealthy and has his own slaves eventually. So this was early on.
Yeah, I've heard of this. Do you remember his name? The early slave holding black early American. His name
not sitting here right now.
Yeah.
I've said his name on the podcast, but that was 4 years ago or something. But we also, so there's been some very interesting work done about these people, and one of the things is that people who had servants under indentures, those indentured servants would be part of their estate. So if you had a contract with somebody and you died, he wouldn't just be freed. The indenture is an asset of the estate. So if he had 2-3 years remaining, that indenture could be sold to somebody else as part of settling the estate. So we know from wills that were kind of probated, if you will, that all of these people had value, and the blacks that came in 1619 had much higher values, which suggests that there was no definite term of years to their condition, that they were probably considered servants for life.
So you're saying that because it's like, well, the value of this contract on this person is higher because it's like, oh no, it's an outright.
There was no contract. There was no presumption that they were ever going to be free. Some did become free by whatever means. Maybe they paid to buy their way out. I don't really know. There were very few black slaves in Virginia well into mid-century. I think a few hundred. And by the beginning of Bacon's Rebellion, which was in 1675, there were more than 40,000 non-Indians in Virginia, and maybe a couple thousand were black. So it was still a very small percentage of the total. But that fell away quickly in the years that followed because the demand, the supply, England finally got to be better off, and the supply of English indentured servants and even Irish indentured servants really fell off. And so to keep these plantations going, they started importing slaves from Barbados and other places.
As you've charted, so Bacon's Rebellion. What is Bacon's Rebellion? What happened? What's the rebellion? Who's rebelling? Who's being rebelled against?
Sure thing. So in Virginia, so the governor of Virginia, so Virginia had royal governors, right? New England was they were self-governed to a great degree. They didn't have royal governors until the 1680s.
And is that again because they essentially were religious refugees? They're like, we're getting the heck out of here. Well, we're starting our own thing.
They had corporate charters from the Crown of England. So they were very keen on making sure they had title to their land, and they would go over and negotiate these things. And so they had legal basis, and that's its own long and tangled story. But they were essentially self-governed. They had towns, and the church members in the towns would elect people to, roles we all know. People would run towns, sheriffs and all that kind of stuff. Virginia wasn't that way at all. It was top down. It had royal governors ever since the Virginia Company's charter was revoked by James I in 1624. Somebody will correct me. And the governor who'd been serving in 1675 had been governor since the 1640s, a guy named Sir William Berkeley, with only a break during the Commonwealth of England. But he had stayed in Virginia, and he was wealthy and was real highly related to very high-level families in England and everything else. And Berkeley had been wildly popular for a long time because there had been a war that had begun in 1644. A Powhatan chief named Opechancanough had sprung an ambush in 1644, and he'd led the resistance to that, and he was very popular. But this had changed by 1675. By 1675, 100 years before, Lexington and Concord, almost exactly, a series of things led to a civil war among the English in Virginia. And the leader of this war was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon himself was fairly highly born. He came from an affluent family, but he was one of these sort of, he'd gotten kicked out of college. He was a troubled rich kid who came over, and about that time, for reasons unrelated to Virginia, Indian attacks on frontier farms had increased, and that's its own long story. And the masterless men, these former indentured servants who had small farms on the frontier, wanted the government of Virginia to organize a militia and go basically, kill all the Indians along the frontier. And Berkeley,
just protect us. Just take care of this.
Right,
these people.
Berkeley thought that was a bad idea. He basically believed in looking at every nation or every tribal group differently as objects of diplomacy and working a nuanced strategy. And he was accused by, call it the populists on the frontier, of wanting to do this because he also had a robust business in Indian trade, which was the case. So he was not considered necessarily an honest broker. Anyway, Nathaniel Bacon leads, this sort of army of these masterless men out of the frontier, and he does the thing you never want to have done, which is he issues a manifesto. Anyone who issues a manifesto, you have to be immediately concerned about, as far as I'm concerned. They never go well, and it didn't in this case. But he led this rebellion, which turned into this civil war. And at one point, Jamestown's burned to the ground, and all kinds of people die, and everything else. And he's finally the rebellion really collapses because about 6 months after this begins, Bacon himself gets horribly sick and dies, and then the remaining leadership is not up to keeping it together much longer. So,
I want to come to the New York and Philly area at this time, but the relationship with the Native Americans and like how has your understanding of what of how that took shape, and maybe how it differs in different parts of the country in those early days? Like, so you mentioned obviously there's this sense of diplomacy among some, and this desire to just expand and settle and have these people not be a problem.
So I think the thing that I think a lot of people don't appreciate, and I may have known it kind of intellectually, but I didn't feel it in my gut before doing this, is that the indigenous peoples of of North America, and certainly the Northeast, had a ton of agency, a ton of geopolitical savvy, and that had been shaped by centuries of conflict before Europeans showed up.
With each other?
With each other. And in the Northeast, New England, and New York, and certainly Eastern Canada, so along the St. Lawrence River, you had, very, very generalizing here, but you basically had Algonquin-speaking tribes along the coast and Iroquoian tribes further inland, upstate New York, Finger Lakes, centered around the Finger Lakes, but aggressively moving to the St. Lawrence and moving across the Hudson and all this. And the Algonquin dialects were quite different from each other. If you were an Algonquin from Rhode Island, you couldn't talk with an Algonquin from Newfoundland. But the languages groupings were wildly different. Like, I've heard it said that the difference between coastal Algonquin and Iroquoians, like the difference between English and Russian, like just wildly different.
Wow.
Like not even word one you can, really get your arms around. And so there was this sort of long tradition of tension, not just between those two groups, but also within them. And the English, when they arrived, became part of the geopolitical mix. So the Pilgrims land at Patuxet, which was the Indian village there, and it had been emptied by an epidemic that had swept the coast of New England in the last 5 years. And the whole coast of New England had been depopulated. Champlain had seen it in 1603. John Smith of Jamestown fame, he'd left Jamestown and he sailed down the east coast, the New England coast. He gave us the name New England. And they'd seen populous villages all along the coastline. When they get there in 1620, all gone. There's nobody within 15 miles of the coast. There's skeletons on the ground. It's like the apocalypse has come through.
Wow.
And so they settle there, and the Pilgrims, once they
How do we know this? I'm sorry to interrupt, but how do we know? Is this from the firsthand accounts that we've got that have been preserved?
Yeah, I mean, these people are all literate. So
they're writing diaries like we've arrived and like there's just it's you. I will come across a skeleton as I'm surveying
and of course the two big leaders of the Pilgrim Fathers, William Bradford and Edward Winslow, both wrote big books about, on Plymouth Plantation, which nobody knew about. It sort of came out in the 19th century. It vanished for a long time.
Wow.
And Edward Winslow wrote a book. So there were all these sort of contemporaneous accounts, and they were all literate. So people did write diaries. They wrote letters home. They wrote all this sort of stuff out of New England. But anyway, this is the situation. So the place is sort of empty, and they sort of build their settlement. And they don't see any Indians for weeks. They're just there. They're building there. And then they see some in the woods. And then one day so they get there in December of 1620. And one day in March of 1621, a big, tall Indian walks through the front of Plymouth settlement and just says, "Welcome, Englishmen."
In English.
In English. And his name is Samoset. And he's a sachem from the Abenaki in Maine, and he's down there visiting. And he was visiting with the big sachem of the Wampanoags, who we called Massasoit. Eventually, Samoset knows a decent amount of English. He could certainly, with hand gestures and other things. And he's learned it from fishermen along the coast. There've been English fishermen along the coast for 90 years at that point. And so there were plenty of Indians who knew some English. Well, he sort of goes back and the next day he shows up and says, Massasoit's coming. Massasoit shows up with 100 fighting men. And the guy we know of is Squanto, Tisquantum, who spoke great English. The reason is because he'd been captured, not by John Smith, but this guy named Thomas Hunt 5 years before and sold into slavery in Spain. And that was illegal to do that particular transaction in Spain. So priests intervened and rescued Squanto and several of the others of these. And he lived in a Spanish monastery for a few years. And then it was learned by an Englishman that they had an English-speaking Indian. He couldn't have known a lot of English because he would have had the same command of it as Anyway, so he goes and lives in England. And he gets back in 1619 before the Pilgrims and sees everyone's dead and he's shocked. So so he then famously helps the Pilgrims. He teaches them how to find eels in the mud in the creek beds in the wintertime and how to grow corn and all that stuff.
We celebrate Thanksgiving. How did you encounter you're reading through this, you're working chronologically. What is the untold story of Thanksgiving from your perspective?
Well, in fact, I did a history of Thanksgiving, which mostly centers around the competing claims for the first Thanksgiving around the U.S., and they're pretty funny. But the first Thanksgiving is celebrated in Plymouth. Happened in some form, but what we know about it comes down to two passages, and the main one is in Edward Winslow's book about Plymouth called, the book is Mort's Relation, and it was written under a pen name, but everyone knows it's Winslow. And he basically, says the harvest is good, and Massasoit shows up with a bunch of deer. They have a feast to celebrate the harvest, and his men went fowling, and they apparently shot like 400 birds. Well, there were only like 50 of them, so that was a lot of birds. Massasoit shows up with deer, and they've had a barley crop, so they have some beer.
So they're having a barbecue. It's like the first Northeastern American Super Bowl.
So they have this event, and days of Thanksgiving were a thing. They had been called upon before. And there's 2 or 3 other candidates, for the most famous of which is the Spanish incursion in 1598. Don Juan de Onate comes up, and he's the first guy in 50 years to come up from Mexico into the Southwest, and they cross the Rio Grande at Presidio, essentially Presidio, Texas. Big Bend.
Yeah,
and they're in terrible shape because they've crossed this, I guess, the Sonoran Desert, and they're starving, and their horses are dying from thirst, and they get to the Rio Grande, and everything's great. And there's a very friendly tribe there, and they have a feast. So the Texans. And Richards, I think, declared that actually the first Thanksgiving. And at some point in the 90s, there's an annual celebration in Plymouth, right? That at some point in the 90s, a bunch of Texans dressed as like conquistadors go up and sort of march in this parade, and the police chief of Plymouth sort of mock arrests them and tosses them in jail, and then they get pardoned. The whole thing was, hilarious, sectional, moment. So people should do more of that kind of thing. In my opinion.
The region. I mean, you're really just talking about entirely different countries functionally.
Yeah,
like in the regions of the North America of the U.S.
Yeah.
The story of Thanksgiving, as I understand it, in part, is that you had an attempt to have collective farming that goes wrong, as one would, because private property rights work, and we'll all work together and share it all doesn't work that great. And when the governor at the time, or so I've heard, the governor at the time says, no, we're actually going to issue land plots and you can keep what you earn. That gives rise to the bumper crop that is our Thanksgiving feast.
Yeah.
Is that apocryphal? Is that a free market apocryphal story of the history of Thanksgiving?
Yes. But there's a version that there's elements of it that are true. So the first Thanksgiving was too soon. I don't think they'd made that decision yet. Because that was the first year. I don't think they'd made the decision there. Where it did happen, and it took them 10 years to figure it out, was it in Jamestown. So the Virginians operated under the Virginia Company, and it was all collective farming, and it was a disaster. And they had a 75% death rate for new people from until the mid 1620s. So the 1607, they've had 17, 18 years of just massively bad problem. And they finally went to, you keep what you grow, and they just had this huge, they solved their starvation problem basically there. The Pilgrims had a milder version of that. And the thing that gets people interested is either Winslow or Bradford talks about like a quadrupling of food output when they did this. But
okay, so there is a sort of like private property bumper crop in both the North and the South in separate instances.
Yeah, but Thanksgiving, a bunch of them died that first horrible winter because they got there in December in New England in the Little Ice Age. They didn't have shelter. It was a mess. But by the time they got around to the fall, there was just so much like food in the water and the woods you could eat, which was not the case nearly the same way in Virginia. And the people in Virginia were just so much less capable because they were constantly at odds with the local Indians, and that was not the case. So the famous story with that is that the Pilgrims show up and they make a peace deal with Massasoit, and they're all very wary of each other for a while. But then in a famous story, Edward Winslow seemingly saves Massasoit's life. He's dying, and Winslow goes and visits him as a diplomatic matter, and his mouth is all full of like fuzz or something, and he's dying. And Winslow scrapes out his tongue and starts feeding him like marmalade on the tip of a knife, and it's the first thing Massasoit's gotten down in days. And, and Winslow says, what you need is chicken soup. So they send it, seriously. So they send, of course, the Indians didn't have chickens. So they send like these runners off to New Plymouth with a note from Winslow, give them some chicken. So they come back with chickens in cages. But by this time, Massasoit has recovered. He's not completely, but he's starting to eat. And he's gotten. So Massasoit says, "Don't kill the chickens. I'm going to grow my own chickens." And that was the introduction of that. But the Pilgrims at Plymouth and the Wampanoags maintained peace for 50 years, and there is no comparable example of that anywhere in North America where European settlers maintained the peace with the locals for 50 years.
Why, in your review of this, did it, if you've got this massive continent and it is thinly populated, and in comes European settlers who themselves are like, no, just people, and they're showing up and they're dying a lot. There's some technological advantage, but it's not like they're wildly technologically superior, right? I mean, I guess they've got, how disparate is the technological component from a war-making perspective? Because I think to some extent we have this story that, the Europeans come in, we're more civilized, and that's why we just dispense with the natives as we march westward.
Well, but they didn't, right? I mean, it was 400 years-ish, 380 or something, between Ponce de Leon in Florida and the end of the Indian Wars at the end of the 19th century. So there was almost 400 years of indigenous resistance to European incursions, settlement, colonization, conquest, pick your verb. It was almost 400 years of resistance, and that at a huge biological disadvantage because they lost big chunks of their population quickly when they got exposed to old world disease, and there was nothing comparable going back for all kinds of reasons. So our descendants bring Europe's old plagues into a population that hasn't had the immune response established to, and they're not just
living in urban squalor or whatnot.
They come in pigs. They come in
new livestock,
mosquito larvae that are floating in barrels of water, that fresh water that's been picked up on the coast of Africa and brought to the Caribbean, and all kinds of ways disease travels. And smallpox takes a long time. Like, people think, oh, it must have been smallpox. Now, all kinds of other things first, because you die too fast of smallpox. So if smallpox was on a ship,
its spreading rate was not that fast.
Well, it would rip through the ship. But the point is everyone would either die or become a permanently immune survivor before the ship got there. So it took quite a while for smallpox to make it. I think in New England it took until the 1600s, but before it hit North America, I think. Always fact check me. So the military advantages of the Europeans were less firearms than they were steel. So armor and swords were really tough to overcome. It took a lot. Arrows could not penetrate the armor, and so the Indians would have to lose a lot of people in close-in combat. But eventually, actually pretty fast, the Indians got European weapons, and that
Level the playing field.
And then you add to that their superior understanding of the geography and the superior understanding of how to get around in the woods silently and all these other things, and their disregard for European military tactics. They were essentially waging. We celebrate the farmers and militia at Lexington and Concord who were shooting from behind trees and stone walls and everything else. Those were Indian tactics.
Oh, so the fighters on behalf of the American Revolution were using Native American guerrilla warfare tactics against the British.
Yeah. Which the English really didn't learn until King Philip's War. Because that was the first really long and extended war in New England, which was in 1675.
So you've got the Puritans, the Pilgrims in New England. You've got the aristocrats in the South, and then you've got Philadelphia and New York.
Well, New York. Long before,
yeah.
Right.
So let's start with New York, and is it the Dutch? Like
yeah. So the Dutch come in pretty early, 1634. Their guy Peter Minuit famously, buys Manhattan in a transaction, and the Dutch settle there, and they have a completely different world from either Virginia or New England.
Yeah, tell me more about that. I mean, the first thing I think about, although I guess this would even be, how does this intersect with sort of the Dutch Industrial Revolution? I guess that comes later.
Well, the Dutch,
but they were already
the Dutch were like in the 1600s. The Dutch were going through their golden era once they fended off the Spanish and the Dutch Republic got some independence. They had fantastically effective ship designs. They were excellent traders, if you had a time machine, you had to set for 1650, okay, and it's set for 1650, and you've got to pick the place. Amsterdam's probably your best bet. Like, the living was good. The Dutch were really wealthy, much more prosperous than the English, and they were a form of republic, as Gordon Wood mentioned. So it was pretty good. But they were all about trade. So the Dutch were not keen on Spanish-style conquest or English-style sort of, landed settlement. What they wanted were trading outposts, and Manhattan Island was perfect for that because it was at the bottom of the Hudson, and
natural ports,
a great natural harbor. And the critical thing to remember is that the principal economic output of the northeastern United States was fur. So the Eurasian beaver had been hunted to the brink of extinction, and furs were very hard to come by in Europe. And they were discovered to be in a seemingly infinite supply in North America. And so if you were, everyone was interested in fur, and the Indians would hunt the fur and they would trade them for European manufacturers. So they would get, steel hatchets, and they would get guns, and they would get, this is probably the first thing they wanted is the women all wanted copper kettles, because
Oh yeah, to
They're
cook.
far better for cooking in than terracotta stuff. And so, these were huge priorities for the Indians, and it raised their standard of living enormously. So they were happy to supply fur to European traders in return for these goods.
So you've got this again, like the fingerprint of the culture of the places is there right from the start. Sort of Manhattan as a business center, the World Trade Center.
Right. So the fur thing is fascinating, right? So what happens? Well, the people along the coastline soon hunt the beaver to sort of local extinction, right? So they need to get it from further upstream, tribes that are not yet in direct contact. All right, well, that's going to set off some conflict, right? There's two ways to get it. One is to trade for it and be a middleman, and the other is conquest. So,
And the Dutch are like, we don't really like the conquest. We'd rather just do some deals.
Well, the Dutch, though, were willing to do all kinds of deals because they were far more willing to trade guns than the English. The English all had laws against selling the Indians guns, which was, probably smart. The Dutch were like, guns, sure. And
was there like a gun? Was it like the gun district of like southern New York, just like filled with Indians, like checking it out and being like, "This is."
The Dutch figured.
We'll take 10.
The Dutch figured out that with guns, the hunting would get easier, and all they had to do was stay on their good side, which they didn't always do. But so they figured that out, and they also figured out that the Iroquois in upstate New York and in Pennsylvania, the Iroquoians, the Susquehannocks, who were Iroquoian, but not part of the Five Nations, long story, they had tons of fur. It was everywhere.
Was there a particular animal? Was it fox?
Beaver.
Was it beaver? It was beaver.
Beaver was dominant.
Okay.
But there are, yes.
Yeah, whatever pelt you could find.
Peltry and in general was good. Beaver was what you really wanted because in Europe they'd beat it into felt, and everyone had felt hats. So beaver felt is beaten fur, right? And so anyway.
Before Patagonia.
Well,
before all oil based.
They used mercury to process it, and that's. The workers would get exposed to mercury and they'd go nuts, which is where "mad as a hatter" comes from. It was from the European fur hat making business driven by North American fur.
Crazy. Okay, so you've got the Dutch, you got Holland traders, not particularly allegiant to any notion of like maintaining like long-term military stuff. Like, we'll sell them guns. Yeah. They're doing good business.
Yeah.
What's the culture like in New York?
It's definitely the most fun place in North America. So the Dutch have no problem with anyone coming in. There were English people who'd come and live there. There were free blacks, the first Jews in North America. I think it might have been like one guy in Rhode Island, but in general, they were there. It was New York from the very beginning was like New York of today in the sense that it was a place of business with people from all over the world conducting that business. That's what that was. And it was, in that sense, it was sort of wide open.
Was there did that exchange make it a just fundamentally less religious oriented place, like as compared to say North England, New England with its Calvinist pilgrims and Puritans?
The Dutch were also Protestants, and they'd been doing their bit in the religious wars with Spain. But they were there on company business. So they were all basically working for the Dutch West India Company. And so even if and again, they weren't trying to build some sort of society, right? So the Spanish wanted to build a city of God on the Rio Grande, and the Franciscans drove the settlement in New Mexico, right? And the New Englanders did some proselytizing, and eventually quite a bit, but mostly they were there because they wanted to practice their religion without being oppressed for it, right? The Dutch were plenty religious, but they just wanted to do business. And the practical considerations led to quite a bit more toleration than you would have ever gotten in New England.
Just commercial culture.
Yeah.
We can do a deal. You're an Indian, you're a Jew, it doesn't matter. We can do a deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
The phrase "a city on a hill."
Yeah.
Where does that come? So probably in the sort of increasingly fading modern context, Ronald Reagan talks about the United States as the shining city on a hill, but he's making a reference to early American history.
Yeah. So in 1630, you get the so-called Puritan Great Migration. Begins in little bits in 1628, but 1630, a fellow named John Winthrop leads more than 1,000 Puritans in something like a dozen ships from England to Boston. And they're originally going to Salem. They've sent an advance guard. They decide Salem isn't suitable. And so they buy, there was one Englishman in Boston. Boston was much smaller then because it's mostly landfill, right? So then it was connected by this narrow neck. It was sort of this teardrop in the middle of the harbor. And there was one Englishman who'd settled there, and they bought his farm, and that farm today is the Boston Common. But they essentially settled in Boston after some puts and takes. The flagship was the Arabella, and John Winthrop, either on departure or at sea, gave a sermon. Winthrop was not a clergy member, he was a lawyer, but he gave a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. And, there are people who say it's one of the sort of 5 greatest sermons ever given. I'm ill-equipped to assess that judgment, but fans of it love it. And what Winthrop is saying is that we're going to build this Christian society that will be seen as an example around the world. And here's what that society should look like. And his metaphor is, he doesn't say shining. He says, it shall be as a city on a hill, meaning people will look up to it. That phrase has been cited, not just Ronald Reagan in our lifetimes, but it's come up again and again and again. And you can easily find a model of Christian charity on that. But I think the thing to take from it, which really tells you a lot about the Puritans, is they were these sort of, they believed that God's favor depended on the community obeying God's law. And so if you know some Old Testament, Israel's fortunes in Old Testament terms would rise and fall. It was said by, whether Israel was following God's law or not.
Yeah. They leave Egypt, they go into the wilderness. Moses goes up to get the tablets, and he comes back down. They're already worshiping idols and stuff, and so it's
David has his ups and downs, the whole thing. So the Puritans believed, as a matter of theology, that Israel was not the only place this was true, that God assessed every community based on how it, as a community, followed God's law. And this is exposed in Winthrop's sermon. Well, this is why the Puritans were so famous at cracking down. They weren't libertarian, they were conformists. If you're going to live here, you got to live this way, believe these things, go to this church, etc. Because they believed, as taught in the Old Testament, if you break God's law, ruin will come to the whole community.
I'm gonna just put a pin to remind myself. I want to talk about your sense of the Christianness of the pre-revolutionary America by the time we get to the 1776. But before I do, I guess one way to round out some of these important cities is to talk about Philadelphia. And so I'm a Philadelphian. I know it's like you've got all kinds of important characters, but who's the first most important one? Is it William Penn when thinking about Pennsylvania and Philadelphia?
Yeah. All right. So I'm really fortunate. So you've reached the outer limit. It's actually just beyond the outer limit of my podcast on the timeline, right? So I've gotten to 1680, and Penn's grant comes in 1681. Fortunately, I've been reading a biography of Penn. So I think the thing there is to realize that Penn was an accidental colonist. Penn was the son of a wealthy admiral who was very much in the king's favor. Penn disappointed almost everybody by becoming a Quaker. The Quakers were considered weirdos in the extreme in the 17th century. And to some degree, they invited that. The Quakers would do things that were very unusual for the 17th century, like the Quaker women would barge into an Anglican church, naked, and start preaching their beliefs. But the crucial thing, if you want to think about this, is
it's called the Quaker state. I can't say that and not see the face of Quaker oats.
Yes. Well, this starts before Pennsylvania, and it starts before Western New Jersey, which becomes its own Quaker settlement. And the crucial thing is that the Quakers were really disliked in New England, profoundly disliked in New England. And why is that? Because the New Englanders, the Puritans, believed that one's connection to God came through Scripture. That, you learned Scripture and found God. And the Quakers believed, hey, you don't need any of that. You're filled with the inner light. And the New Englanders,
they were New Agers.
They were New Agers, and
running around naked.
Apologies to all the Quakers out there. You're gonna get mail, but
my mother-in-law has her genetic line goes all the way back to the Quakers. In fact, she came to visit. She's not from the East Coast, but she came to visit, and my family, and we. She's like, I want to go see Quaker stuff. And I'm like, okay. So we drive to Germantown, which is not a very good neighborhood anymore, to see these original Quaker churches and whatnot.
My son went to a Quaker prep school, George School in Newtown, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So
back when we lived back east. So I'd say, so just to center the timeline, because it all kind of ties together. So New Netherlands is there from 1634 to 1664.
Is it in Pennsylvania?
No, in New York.
Oh, okay, New York. Okay, right.
So you got New
Netherlands,
Amsterdam.
Holland, the Dutch.
Then in 1664,
there's too many terms, by the way, for the Dutch. It's Holland, it's Netherlands. It's you think Dutch. I don't know. I've always found that confusing.
Yeah, I can understand that. The Dutch. Just go with the Dutch.
Yeah, keep it simple.
And so they're in New York, and tension is rising during the mid-century, between middle of the 1600s, between England and the Netherlands, because
In Europe.
And also in the New World, in particular in the Caribbean. Okay, and so there, 3 Anglo-Dutch wars happen, and there are awesome stories in and of themselves. But the second one is triggered because Charles II, who's the restored Stuart king after the Commonwealth of England falls, Charles II awards his brother, James, Duke of York, basically, a huge chunk of the Northeast. So he basically gets kind of his brother sort of, and this irritates the Puritans no end, but he gets Maine and he gets Long Island, which Connecticut viewed as theirs, but he gets Long Island and he gets New York and New Jersey. And there's a big argument, does he also get the west bank of the Delaware River? But he definitely gets New York, New Jersey, Long Island, and Maine. So the Duke of York sends in a fleet even before the Second Anglo-Dutch War shows up. He sends all these ships in and, did a little bit like what we did in Venezuela. He, without shooting any shot, he shows up and his admiral, Richard Nichols, basically says, "This is ours." And the governor of New York, Peter Stuyvesant, had like 2 working cannons. And
like, fine. Can we keep trading these pelts? That's all I care about.
They didn't kill anyone. They let everyone keep trading. They let everyone do everything. Stuyvesant got to settle on his farm. Yeah. I'm sure you're aware of the big housing project there, Stuyvesant Town, and the east side of New York. You've probably been through it.
It's been gentrified quite a bit, but certainly while I lived in New York, Bed-Stuy was not exactly the best place
Brooklyn,
to be.
But yeah.
Yeah.
But Stuyvesant Town in the Lower East Side of Manhattan
Stuyvesant Town
was this big I think wartime. It goes back quite a ways. My brother lived there, like East 30th Street or something. New Yorkers send letters. But that was on Stuyvesant's farm, and he retires there. They let him. And so the English now have both New York and New Jersey. And there's all kinds of tension. There's, and New Jersey in particular is a governance catastrophe because they can't get
so nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed. They can't get the titles right. And James quickly gives away New Jersey to a couple of fellow nobles who then sell the western. They divide it into 2, and so there's an east and a west New Jersey. And West New Jersey is sold to a bunch of Quakers, in the mid-1670s. And they immediately get into this internecine quarrel. Well, William Penn is like a super influential Quaker in England, and he is sucked in to adjudicate this, sort of intra-Quaker fight over Western New Jersey, which has nothing in it, and it's this ridiculous. It's just these guys are.
Is this is this the north or the south of New Jersey? Is this like near where Philadelphia is? Or?
Yes, it's basically runs from like Burlington, New Jersey, if you know the area, down to the southeast to roughly. It runs a little north of there, like in the Princeton area. There's a road that cuts through called Province Line Road, and for a big stretch, Province Line Road follows the division between East and West Jersey. So there's echoes of this, Taylor ham, pork roll,
Well, one of the things that now we're talking, and maybe this will be too provincial for viewers who aren't from the area, but one of the things like in my lifetime is New Jersey is a bifurcated state, in that it's influenced by New York in the north and then Philadelphia in the south. Like, it's still to
so
this
on
day.
Your way home, scroll back. You'll see it. I wrote an episode. It's called "Hey, What About New Jersey?" And I talk about all that stuff. And you may like it or you may not.
No, I will. And
at least one guy I listened to it wrote this spiteful comment on Spotify about it. But I lived there for like 20 years of my life. So I feel like, and my daughter was born there. So I feel like I could talk about New Jersey.
Where in Jersey did you live?
I lived in Ridgewood for 4 years in Bergen County. And then I lived in Princeton with my family from 1999 to about 2014. But I also went to the Lawrenceville School for 2 years in Lawrenceville and then Princeton. So that's 6 more years. So I think I've got like 26 years.
North and south. Well, you got a bunch of Jersey in you.
Yeah.
So William Penn is this reluctant guy.
So he kind of gets sucked into settling this, and 1, 2, skip a few. He gets this grant to Pennsylvania, which means Penn's Woods. And he actually wanted to just call it Sylvania. But because he was actually very pious and he didn't want this to be about him. And the king says, no, this is actually about your dad, who was my friend and served me very well. So we're calling it Pennsylvania.
It's like, I don't want it to be about me. Don't worry, it's not. It's about your dad.
That's pretty much it.
Just cool off.
That's pretty much
cool off, Junior.
Anyway, if we ever do this in the future, I'll know a lot more than I do now about Pennsylvania. I mean, I know something. I certainly know about New Sweden, which was the colony along the west bank of the Delaware before Penn showed up. So there were all these, from Wilmington north, south to Newcastle, and north to roughly Philadelphia International Airport was a Swedish colony.
Are there any other states that in this early period whose cultures are distinct and whose origins sort of feed into that culture in a way that you've come across, and it's like, oh, I see the current American fingerprint in this origin.
Oh yeah, I mean, so Maryland, it gets going pretty early, and it's famously under the Lord Baltimore, a Catholic colony, and it has all sorts of hilarious civil conflicts because Puritans will move in there. Protestants chafe under, sort of Catholic rule. Very interesting to go to St. Mary's City, by the way, which is, kind of an hour south of Washington. It's like really, it's worth a half day. I mean, it's very interesting if you learn the history of the founding of Maryland. The Ark and the Dove were the sort of maiden ships that came over, and you had this settlement there that also became tobacco growing. It was never as lethal as Virginia. It was a somewhat more temperate climate, and it's its own fascinating story. The best part is it kept having these, like micro civil wars between various people. So
what does that mean? What's a micro civil war look like?
There was a bunch of guys go out into the streets. A war around this event called Fendall's Rebellion, which, kind of 28 people die. But they have a real battle and a bunch of people die. And, there was a Virginian named Thomas Claiborne who refused to recognize the Calvert grant to Maryland, and he owned Kent Island, and he claimed a competing claim to Kent Island, and he made several attempts over 30 years to reconquer Kent Island. They were all comical. Few people would get shot or whatever. It was remarkable. But some things come down. So there's this weird black and white checks on the Maryland state flag, and until like 3 years ago, on the University of Maryland football helmets, if you ever watched Maryland football, they had this goofy helmets. That's the Calvert family crest, So the Lord Baltimore's crest was on University of Maryland terrapin helmets for most of my life. So,
slavery in the South, what, in your reading of the origins and the sequence, gives rise to what is distinctive about it in North America in the early days of what will become the United States?
Well,
How much have you covered that history?
I've started to. I've sort of entered into the phase when it really begins to evolve. I'd say there's a bunch of interesting things about North American slavery, which people trying to score political points today will cite in one direction or another. One of the interesting things about it is that the African slaves in North America in general, certainly in Virginia in the 17th century, had much better survival rates than they did in the Caribbean or South America, and would often reproduce. And so, there was eventually surplus labor being generated, and that created its own kind of tension. We had a unique dynamic around that. I would say, which I'm still learning about. I'd say the thing that has been often suggested, certainly until the middle part of the 20th century, was that it wasn't that bad to be a slave in Virginia. That is pretty ridiculous, and yet you still see it raised in sort of people on especially the right, who want to raise these things, raise history as a political weapon. So we talked about the indentured servants in Virginia, and they were treated much worse than indentured servants in England, because they had gotten all their compensation up front in the form of transportation. And the only sanction you had was extending their indenture.
Yeah.
So to get them to do any work at all, you had to whip them. There was a lot of...
Because you've already paid me, I'm here, I just need to wait it out and not die.
Yeah.
And I'll be free.
Right. So I'm not going to...
I'm not getting anything. The marginal output gets me nothing.
Right. So you're going to work as little as you can. And the only way a master could get more work out of them was coercion. Well, so they passed a bunch of rules. They constrained them in all kinds of ways. They weren't constrained in England. The system evolved to become quite brutal in the treatment of English indentured servants. So when Africans first came in, or for that matter, Indians were first enslaved, the standard of treatment was really bad to begin with. And if you think about this problem of payment in advance, well, you had that problem even more so with African slaves, because they came in and they were there forever. They were slaves. And so there was no sanction you could use to get them to work other than just unbelievably ugly stuff, whipping, coercion, and all the rest of this. And so as the Virginians began to realize this, they increasingly liberalized the laws around the treatment of slaves in ways that would prevent overseers and masters from getting into legal trouble. So, if you...
interesting. So basically it was like, well, our system, the behavior here is real bad. We'll have to put everyone in prison if we actually actually treat these people the way they deserve to be treated, the slaveholders. Right.
So a constraint on whipping your English indentured servant, even in the New World, even in Virginia, was that, if you kill him, that is a legal problem for you. You can be brought up for homicide. Okay. Well, they had to inflict so much more pain to get, and again, I'm talking about averages.
Yeah.
They had to, in general, inflict so much more pain that they were at much greater risk of killing these guys. And yes, they didn't have an incentive to kill them because they were killing off, in theory, an asset. So there was that countervailing thing which people point out. Why would you kill your slave? The answer is you'd kill him by mistake. You can't perfectly dial up torture. People die. But you needed to torture them to get them to work because they had nothing to live for. I mean, literally. And so there was this constant need to sort of liberalize the legal impact or reduce the legal impact on overseers and masters. And it occurred over a period of years, and they kept finding problems they needed to solve. And eventually you got this race-based, incredibly brutal system in place. And yes, there were, as decades went by, there were more and more people who were famously had moral qualms about this, but they're trapped. I mean, Washington definitely thought slavery was bad, but he had no way to run his plantations or his business without it. His solution, because he had no kids, was to emancipate them on his death. But if you had kids and it was an estate and you were charged with leaving that, you probably didn't do that. And that eventually became illegal too in some places. So,
I want to talk a little bit about and hear, what you've learned in traversing this material. It's like you said, we started to reach the point in the timeline where you're not as well read.
Well, I hit 1680. All right, that's not bad.
How, as someone who is, I hate to almost say self-teaching here, because what does it mean to learn about history if not to read books and materials? Like what constitutes being an academic versus a retired, deeply curious person?
Outstanding question. And
how do you understand your enterprise? Also, just through the lens of like all of us, if you're watching up to this point in this conversation, you're a curious person that cares about it finds our country's history interesting. What has it taught you to do this?
Let me hit the first part of that, and then we can circle around. So you've sort of touched on a thing I'm specific about. I am not a historian. A lot of people think that, somebody who knows a lot of history and maybe does a podcast is a historian. Not the case. Historians are specifically trained to do things that I only sometimes dabble in. Okay, so historians do their work in source material, original documents, or digitized versions of original documents or whatever. Sure. They don't rely on secondary sources for the basis of their work. They go to the root of it.
It's like, all right, here's the charter that William Penn got.
Even if they read something in a biography of William Penn, they'll follow the notes through and go look at the original source. I'm pumping out history podcasts. I do a little of that. So that's the first thing. I don't work in original sources in the main. Secondly, historians are expert in the context at the time. So they will understand that, a given thing in this time is, related to the world around it in a specific way. So they'll understand, for example, that the Puritans didn't kick people out because they were, narrow-minded church ladies. They kicked them out because they had deeply refined theological point of view that it was necessary for God's favor on the community, right?
Sure.
And an awful lot of people who you read write about New England, like, don't understand that. I'm not saying historians, but there's a lot of anti-Puritan sentiment that in people who try and write about New England in the 17th century, they just don't get that basic point.
I mean, it's funny that you say that, and because I'm just the notion of the U.S. having a puritanical streak is like this pop parlance that you'll sometimes hear, even like English and Europeans say. It's like, oh, there is that. Well, the U.S. does have that puritanical streak, like often talking about, say, the religious right in America. Like, well, that's that puritanical streak.
Yeah,
and it's just.
Yeah,
it's just sort of a weird shorthand. It doesn't.
But I mean, it has real roots, right? And the other thing historians are trained to understand is historiography. So, how is our interpretation of an era or an event or whatever changed over time? So they're experts in that, and those are the things that. Getting a PhD will train you to do. You could learn that yourself. You could become somebody who does all those things without getting a PhD. But if you don't do those things, you really have no business calling yourself a historian. I'm a humble history podcaster. Now, when I get to know something, I think I get to know it at a pretty high standard. There are very few history podcasters that show their sources to the level I do. So I try to get it right.
Yeah.
And when I get it wrong, I put in an errata or something. I make a note that, oh, I got this wrong. So I think I go to greater efforts than most to show my work and so forth. And yet, I'm at best a popularizer, and I'm not as good as David McCullough, who's not a historian either, and said so.
When I was a kid going through K through 12 school, I thought history was boring. I think a lot of kids do. It's taught in a way, in general, that's not very good for wanting to care about it.
Yeah.
Unless you're super lucky and have like an incredible teacher. And then as I got older and I had a long commute from New Jersey into New York, I started listening to David McCullough books and realized, wow, I'm really interested in our history. And even my own mistakes in this conversation speak to my inadequacies. But that one of the things that we are awash in, and I'm personally guilty as charged, is we're in this age where we feel like we have access to all the information in the world if we just want to go search for it. And we can very quickly get pretty confident in what we think we know about whatever it is we think we just did research on. And I'm not poo-pooing do your own research. There's a whole bunch of stuff about the language around that that's like mostly weird power games.
Yeah.
But what's your advice for the curious person wanting to like tunnel with the things we have available, which also now include these hallucinating AI models that are getting better and better, but still you won't know what they're getting wrong exactly. How do you think about that? How do you think about navigating this information landscape as a truth seeker that's curious?
Well, I think it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to, write a 5,000 word podcast script, I did 10,000 words on the Pueblo Revolt. It doesn't take too long to find the sort of key, well-regarded sources for that kind of thing that have stood the test of time. And you can usually find them in the footnotes to things that are less good. I mean, a lot of the time, it's perfectly reasonable if you're doing what I do to, start with a Wikipedia page. Now, I don't really read the Wikipedia page. I go right to the references. And so you look down at the references, and because, the people who do that have a sort of arcane interest in putting these, there's usually interesting stuff in the references. And the awesome thing about the world in which we live is an awful lot of original documents or translated ones, if they were in Spanish, are just available online various places. Yale has this thing called the Avalon Project, where they've got just, I think, thousands of original colonial documents that, sorted by year or decade. So you can go read the Charter of Pennsylvania as issued to William Penn. You don't have to read 4 sentences quoted from it in a book about William Penn. You can read the whole damn charter, which is, 2,000 words or something. I mean, it's not long. You can just go do that. And that would have been really hard even 30 years ago. That would have been you can dig pretty deeply. And if you get interested in something, challenge yourself to read competing narratives and so forth. And then you also, if you do enough of it, as I've now been doing since I've been doing this 5.5 years, you develop a pretty good, BS detector. And one of mine is, frankly, presentism. If I'm reading some book about, I don't know, the Pequot War in New England, pick your thing. And this is an example I give. I don't know if I ever read this case, but this is how it would be. And somebody's like, and they were totally brutal to these Indians when they killed 800 of them, burning down the village. I'd be like, all right, all you had to do was tell me they burned down the village, and estimates are that they killed 800. I can figure out that was like harsh. So you start to see people who write frivolously as having an axe to grind. But the other thing you get good at as you go along, or better at it, is detecting a cousin of this, which is, historians use the term anachronism. And an anachronism is inserting a thing into that moment that didn't actually exist in that moment. Okay? So, and you could tell that whoever it was is just spitballing. So I read something recently about the British in Boston in the winter of 1775, 76, and this guy is talking about General Gage. He's going to the plays, and he talks about him drinking brandy and smoking cigars. All right, well, cigars didn't become a thing in the British world until the 19th century. They smoked tobacco out of pipes and other things, I know something about cigars, and they didn't exist then for all practical purposes. I mean, there were probably some that, kind of got around to it, but they were pretty much out of time then. They came in soon after.
So you're catching.
I'm skeptical of the John Adams smoking a cheroot in the HBO miniseries. Yeah. I'm skeptical of that. It's possible, but I'm skeptical.
These are the Starbucks cup in the back of the scene of a House of Dragon kind of stuff. It's like, well, somebody left their Starbucks cup in there.
Yeah, I mean, but you see this quite a lot in historical writing. And I think historians, to get to the point, what's the difference between me and a historian? Historians are really expert in knowing what is out of place and not. And, you'll see somebody refer to soldiers using rifles. You'd be like, probably not. They barely existed then. They were probably using muskets or arquebuses,
One of the things that makes this harder to navigate, this world of who's got the training, who's an expert, is our academic institutions have very, very deep ideological bias.
Yeah.
And, you're on the board of FIRE, the Foundation for
Individual rights
and expression. It was education. That's why I was blank. I was like, I don't want to say the old
Yes,
version.
it was.
Yeah. But it's strong interest in education. They rank schools on the basis of free expression and a bunch of other things. So you've got a front row seat to a lot of the pathologies of academia.
Yes.
So let's talk about that for a little bit, because one of the challenges is you've described in a fairly noble way the norms of a profession called being a historian. But there is all these other things going on in the actual world of actual people currently in academia who have this title and their PhD that are often super biased, like ideologically, not just like, it's fine to have a worldview. I have a worldview I'm very transparent about. But it's all in one direction, like overwhelmingly. And history as an area is particularly, like, of the things, history is actually pretty big. Like, I went and and for something, I looked at one of these reports on political giving. And I think the history departments were among the most slanted. And of course, towards Democrats, because it's academia. But how do you think about the reality of bias in history as an actual academic community? Have you thought much about it? Looked at it? What's your sense of it?
Yeah. So
because I can get a little like a pox on these people, and that's like excessively unfair, probably. But
one of the things I've started to do is I go to the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, which is the group of academic historians, but you could just join it. And I had it in mind because my dad would go to it. And so I go and I sort of lurk. And actually, I saw that when I went to the 2024 meeting in San Francisco, it was especially political. And
it's an election year.
It was at the beginning of 2024, and it was kind of, it was really irritating. I came back and I did the one editorial episode I've done in the podcast reporting on this. Another thing you can listen to on the ride home. It was me at the American Historical Association, and I've since written it up in a Substack, which I can just send you that.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes for sure.
So on the one hand, this derives from a really old argument in the historical profession about what is the purpose of history, okay, studying it and doing scholarship. And it used to be, although now more than 100 years ago, that this was understood as being objective as you can. And I think that was the dominant ideal into the 1970s. But that began to change at the turn of the 20th century. There was a guy named Charles Beard at Harvard, and they believed that history should be usable, that it should teach applicable lessons for today. And so there's been a debate. I mean, there must be 10 shelf feet of writing on this topic about what's the purpose of history inside academia for more than a century now. And I would say all through that time, there's been a meaningful group of historians that land where I do, which is if you approach it with bias, if you approach it to prove a point, you're blinding yourself to what happened, and you're denying yourself its chief benefit, which is the wisdom of epistemic humility, that you will learn to have good judgment. There are an awful lot of people, especially who came out of, they went to graduate school during Vietnam, and they came out, so it goes back now quite a ways, who were infused with a political mission for their history.
It's that late 60s, early 70s hippie, postmodern Marcuse hellstorm of nonsense.
but there's still a big division about this. So I wrote this piece on the weaponization of history, and I got emails from quite a few history professors around the country saying, exactly right. So, including a couple people who had written big books on the topic. So this is still a big division within academic history, and it's a legitimate argument to have. I think that well, my feelings on this are that it's really a shame. I will say there is a piece of, I think, revealing and excellent news, and it comes from FIRE's own data. So FIRE has done massive surveys of political tolerance among undergraduates who major in given fields.
Mm-hmm.
And
how is tolerance defined in this instance?
Openness to opposing political views, and
to having them heard, to working alongside people who believe them,
all that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't have the questions at the top of my head, but they did a big study of this, which FIRE certainly believes is valid, and I believe is, because they do really good work in this area. And as I recall, the most tolerant undergraduate major was philosophy, most open to competing ideas, and the second most were history majors.
Sociology is probably a disaster.
There's a lot of them. So so I would say that tells me that there's still an awful lot of people in the teaching of history who are forcing people to look at both sides of a problem and are truly putting themselves in that moment, because that's how you would get that kind of output.
One of the things that I think is a shame about ideas, ideology, and identity is when you put your ideology into your identity as a sort of inextricable part. Like, if without this belief, I will no longer be me, or if you attack this belief, this position I hold, it's an attack on me as the person. It does really bind and blind you. You are bound to this thing now. You've made it who you are. So you have no incentive to listen to somebody who says, well, that's not true, or you've got that wrong, because it's like, well, then you're like, it's like, what are you saying? It's like, you're like worthless, or you're like, your whole identity is invalidated. What's your advice for guarding against that impulse? Because to some extent, I think that you can't fully guard against it or even want to, insofar as there are things that we call beliefs, faith, foundational principles, that you want embedded. You want embedded in what constitutes being a good person. So there's a line that you have to draw at some point in that then becomes like, well, no, I'm going to be willing to change my mind on X. And how do you think about where that is as you read history, as you try to be humble, have this epistemic humility?
Well, where I would start is our greatest, most famous people in not just American history, but whether it's Western history or world history, who built wildly successful societies, who were a long time viewed as heroes, also along the way made some really bad decisions about all sorts of things in good faith, which means it's absolutely the case that we're doing the same thing. Okay, so anyone who is certain today that they know the right thing to do in all these different policy areas that we're talking about, is definitely wrong, like about half of it, because everyone in the past was really wrong, we do all kinds of stuff now that'll be really wrong. And when you ask people, like one of the things I do is I go, so we all agree that everyone in the past was really wrong about all this stuff. What are we really wrong about? And you'll always hear from people something that just lines up perfectly with their political views, right? So you'll hear from somebody on the left like, yeah, we'll be condemned for eating meat. Well, maybe not. And you'll hear from somebody on the right, oh, we'll be condemned for, abortion, or people will think that, gender medicine is a war crime or something, So, people will offer these things that just prove how right they are.
And what does it say about me that I actually agreed? I agreed with all three of those.
Well, I am, and I think we're helped in this. I think there are people who have sort of libertarian bent are, I'm like, I naturally hate the idea of joining the crowd on anything. So if something looks like it's becoming like this super popular idea within any group, my instant sense is to like react against that and get very suspicious.
You're the political antibody.
And I'm very, very much that way. And I'm a sort of, I won't say double hater, but that's probably close. Politically, Christopher Hitchens once said, if you vote the party line, you're saying you believe in a one-party system. And I agree with him. So I always split my ticket. There's always somebody who's just repulsive on whatever side I would lean to generally, and I'll vote against that person. I just do it as a matter of self-respect. And that makes, I have all kinds of, I probably lose like half my listeners saying this, but I think that's the case. So I think you can do it if you, again, learn the lesson of history, which is really great people and also ordinary people. We're just like massively wrong about all kinds of stuff all the time, and that means we are.
As we come to an end, and I sort of raised this early in our conversation, but we've talked about all these distinct origins at the early stages in this early phase of the American, what would become the United States of America, and the Spanish flavors that don't even come into the story proper until much later when we move west, right? So they're not even they're not colonies, they're not part of what would be these United States early. But how do you think about, how has your view of the notion of being an American changed over the course of the 5 years? And specifically the notion that there is a unified thing that's not simply your passport called being an American.
Yeah, I think that I think the unifying story of Americans, whether they came here voluntarily, came here on slave ships, or are the survivors of 400 years of war on the indigenous side, is just an unbelievable amount of initiative, tenacity, and grit. The foundation of this country keeps changing at some level. People want to point to a moment in time, and this was the demographic mix then, and that was just awesome. I think that the story has changed repeatedly, and yet it takes a certain kind of person to come here, which is why we've never really built a sort of cradle-to-grave welfare state. It's still the case that most Americans, rubs them the wrong way at some level. And so I think that we've lost too much. On my Substack, I've been reading a 100-year-old civics textbook and writing about how we taught civics about the generation.
Well, it was being taught.
As it was
so
being
there's
taught,
that.
and why we stopped teaching it. So I'm actually not anti fairly robust lawful immigration, but I think it was a huge mistake to give up assimilation as an ideology and to stop teaching how to be an American. So if I could snap my fingers and do one thing, I would bring back the teaching of old school civics and the philosophy of assimilation. You come here and there are certain fundamental things we believe in, which include individualism, including the right of free speech and religious worship, and all these things which got reflected in our Constitution because we had smart people doing that. So I think that, but I also recognize, and sorry to go on, but I also recognize a big thing I've learned is the tremendous and really nice historical diversity around the country. So wherever, like I keep learning that if you grew up in state A, you had a very different emphasis on things than if you grew up in state B. And in lots of ways that are funny, like I told the story of the Narvaez expedition, which resulted in this guy, Cabeza de Vaca, and 3 other dudes surviving in Texas for 6 years in the 1520s and 30s. And Cabeza de Vaca it's an amazing story. I did 4 or 5 episodes on him. Cabeza de Vaca is unknown to most Americans unless they grew up in Texas. And if they grew up in Texas and took Texas history in the 7th grade, they know who he was. So, all kinds of people who read tons of history in Philadelphia have no idea who this guy is.
Yeah.
And you could talk to a bartender, and if he grew up in Amarillo or something and took Texas history or anywhere in the state, he'd be like, oh yeah, Cabeza de Vaca, yeah. And in Wisconsin, this guy, Jean Nicolet, Champlain sends this dude to Green Bay in 1634, all the way through the Great Lakes to trade with the Indians over there. His name is Jean Nicolet. And he shows up in this silk robe and makes a treaty with the Ho-Chunks and in Wisconsin, they all know who John Nicolet is. There's Nicolet State Park, Nicolet State Bank, there's and so that's the difference. And that's like that all over the country. And that's fantastic.
Yeah, this is the thing that it's like this lucky, incredible miracle of the United States that it's like a really, I don't know if there's anywhere else on this planet that combines like legal and cultural diversity to this extent, but you're still part of the same country for real. And you still just drive straight across it and you still feel like an American and you feel excited. You get to Colorado and you look at the Rockies and they're your Rockies, even though it's like the first time you've been there.
If you're feeling down about the country, get out and actually see it. See America. Matt Welch says this all the time. I'm 100% with him. I just did. In fact, I completed it on Sunday. I just did with a college buddy. We drove from Tampa to New Orleans and basically looked at like forts and went into dive bars the whole way. But it was a history tour of the Gulf, and it was fantastic. I mean, there's so much stuff. There's all these old forts. There's the Aviation Museum in Pensacola, which is unbelievably cool. If you've not been to that, you have to go. The Naval Aviation Museum there. And we had this fantastic time. And I try to get out and do these See America road trips whenever I can. My wife is usually my companion. She's very into it. Get out there and see it.
I've been, at this point now, to get my 50 states bucket list, I think I have either 6 or 7 still to go.
I nailed my 50th last June.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Jack, I ask this of every first-time guest. The show is called Dad Saves America because I think as men, in particular, being a father has this incredible power. It is a superpower. It is a thing you can do that ripples out, first starting with your family, but to the community and to the country. And so I think dads can save America by being good dads. And then I try to be one on the show. I think that's the role we can play. How do you think about your role in the American story?
Well, I mean, it's changed, right? I am a dad, and I obviously spent a huge part of my life consumed and probably too consumed with my career. And I wanted to raise children who were good people. I actually have 4 because I got remarried, and I have a son and a daughter of my own, son and a daughter on the stepside, and they're all good friends, and they're all on a chat, and they're all in their 30s, and they're all excellent human beings. They're like, okay. So I felt like I had my local impact. I will say that this project has put me in touch with a whole subculture of people known in the game as history dads. So I can now go to any big city in the country and put the word out, and somewhere between 5 and a dozen people somewhere between your age and my age will show up at a brewery and drink beer with me and ask me the super nerdiest questions in the world, which is just wildly good. But I don't have a overarching mission for the podcast, but I do want to have whatever impact I can have on how people should think about history. And you've heard me now many times on that, just in this couple of hours we've spent together. So that's what I can do. The country's not perfect. Honestly, talk about the good parts and the bad parts. But the critical thing is really try to understand why even well-motivated people made the decisions they made when they made them.
Epistemic humility. Jack Henneman, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you so much for having me.